The moment I decided to faint, I had already chosen whose arms I was going to fall into. I want that clear before the incident report, before the medical clearance, before the committee review of what happened in Assessment Room 3 on a Tuesday in October. I was not dizzy. I was not dehydrated. I was not overwhelmed by the stress inoculation protocol the program used to identify which candidates would break under sustained pressure. My vitals, had anyone checked them, would have shown one elevated variable. Commander Vespercade, standing precisely 3 feet behind me, whose presence I had been tracking with the involuntary precision of someone trained to notice threats, unable to convince myself she was not one. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. The CADE selection program did not officially exist. That was the first thing they told you when you accepted the invitation. Not in a dramatic way. There was no formal briefing with dim lights and a man in a suit explaining classification levels. It was delivered in a footnote, almost, appended to the acceptance letter in language so dry and institutional, it took 3 readings to understand what it was actually saying. The program operated under administrative cover. It placed graduates in positions that also did not officially exist, inside agencies whose full names were on no public record. What you were selecting for, precisely, was never clearly specified, which was itself part of the selection. What it looked like from the inside was this: a 6-month residential program at a converted facility outside an unnamed city, approximately 42 candidates drawn from military intelligence, federal law enforcement, specialized academic programs, and a small number of categories that were never described. You lived in the compound. You ate in the compound. You underwent assessments in the compound: psychological, physical, cognitive, interpersonal, on a schedule that was never published more than 12 hours in advance, which was itself a test of something. The ratio of evaluators to candidates was 4-to-1, which was also itself a test of something. I arrived as candidate number 16 in the current cohort. I was 27 years old, had spent 4 years in military intelligence doing work I was still technically not allowed to describe, and had reached the stage in that career where a door had opened that I had not expected, and I had chosen to walk through it before I could think carefully enough to stop myself. My cohort arrived on a Sunday in late June. Commander Vespercade addressed us in the main assembly room at 1900 hours. I had read the program literature. There was no leadership biography included, which I had noted and filed as information. The first time I saw her, she was standing at the front of the room with both hands at her sides, and no podium and no notes, and no preparation visible in any of the standard places people put preparation. She was tall in the way that read, before height, straight, contained, occupying space like she had decided exactly how much of it to use and had allocated accordingly. Dark hair pinned at the back of her neck, a dark gray jacket over a black tactical shirt, a watch on her left wrist, eyes that swept the room with the specific efficiency of someone who was not introducing herself but assessing. She said, "This program selects for individuals who can sustain operational effectiveness under conditions of prolonged uncertainty, incomplete information, and interpersonal pressure. You were not invited because you are the best. You were invited because we believe you might become the best, under sufficiently specific conditions. It is our job to determine whether those conditions exist." She said this without warmth, and without the performance of warmth, which told me more about her than the words did. She spoke like someone who had learned long ago that precision was a form of respect, and that softening things for an audience was a version of condescension. She addressed the room for 7 minutes. Then she left. I watched her leave. I noted the way she walked. Not quickly, not slowly, with the kind of measured pace that said the exit was not a retreat, but a decision. Tova Mas, The senior assessment officer, who became our primary daily contact, told us afterward that Commander Cade ran the program but was not always physically in the building. She coordinated oversight, managed field placement, and appeared at significant assessment junctures. I filed this information. I told myself it was useful to understand the authority structure. It was not only that, the program was relentless. Not in the way people imagine, not constant physical punishment or psychological cruelty. Relentlessness, I learned over the following weeks, looks less dramatic than it sounds. It looks like an assessment scheduled the morning after a 32-hour cognitive evaluation. It looks like a conflict simulation where two candidates who have been sharing space for 60 days are placed in direct institutional opposition. It looks like a debrief with your evaluator at the end of a week where you have given everything available, and instead of acknowledgement, there is only a brief nod and a document placed in front of you that outlines the 3 specific things you still need to improve. I was performing well. This was not modesty and not bragging. It was the specific knowledge that came from watching 41 other people undergo the same assessments and being able to benchmark my own performance in real time. My cognitive markers were strong. My physical metrics were at program ceiling in most categories. My interpersonal assessments, the ones measuring how I behaved under social pressure, under authority challenge, under the observation of people I was trying to impress, were where things got complicated. The complication had a name. It had the name Commander Vesper Cade, who appeared at significant assessment junctures, which was accurate and which turned out to mean approximately every 3rd or 4th day, which was more frequent than I had calculated when Tova first said it. She appeared during assessment reviews. She stood at the back of rooms or in the gallery, above the practical assessment floor. She sometimes walked the floor during physical components, not to coach, but to observe, clipboard in hand, moving with that unhurried economy that made you aware of every decision your body was making. She watched everything. She disclosed nothing. She spoke to candidates during formal debrief sequences only, in language that was surgical and useful and entirely devoid of the personal, except once. In the 2nd month, during a debrief on a surveillance detection exercise where I had made a correct call in a high-pressure moment that the evaluators had structured to encourage the wrong call. She was reviewing my decision matrix with the same forensic attention she brought to all debriefs, and she said, in the middle of a sentence that was technically about threat pattern recognition, "Your instinct here was right. You trusted it ahead of the framework. That is the harder thing to teach." I looked at her across the debrief table. She moved on immediately to the next decision point. It was, in 4 months, the most personal thing she had said to me. I thought about it more than I should have. I kept filing the data I was accumulating, the way she stood, the specific vocabulary she used for different kinds of correct decisions, the half-second before she looked away, when I held her gaze a fraction too long. I kept filing it and telling myself it was professional attention. By October, I had run out of convincing arguments for that position. The morning of Assessment Room 3, I had learned, through the specific compound information network that develops in any residential program when people are under sustained pressure and have limited distractions, that Commander Cade was reviewing track assignments. A track reassignment was not a removal from the program. It was a redistribution of focus, a narrowing of what you were being assessed for, a signal that the evaluators had decided something about your placement category. A track reassignment down was considered a demotion in everything but name. It moved you from field operational track to analytical support track, which was still a legitimate outcome, still a real career path, still a place where good people landed and did good work. It was not what I had come here for. Pip Reese, who was 22 and the youngest candidate in the cohort, and had the specific social obtuseness of someone who had never needed to be tactful because she had always been the smartest person in any room she walked into. told me about the reassignment review during breakfast, with the tone of someone sharing interesting information rather than delivering a blow. "Your name was on the preliminary list," she said. "The reassignment review." Assessment Officer Moss had it up on her screen when I went to collect my evaluation summary this morning. I set my coffee down. "Were other names on the list?" I asked. "4," Pip said. "But the other 4 have been underperforming on the physical components and everyone knows it. Your physical markers are—" Pip paused, with the unself-conscious accuracy of someone who had not yet learned that being right is not always the same as being kind. "Yours are better than everyone else's except Thoby's, and Thoby is 6'2", and spent 5 years running obstacle courses professionally." I picked my coffee back up. "There's probably a reason," Pip added helpfully. "I know," I said. She looked at me with those clear, unfiltered 22-year-old eyes. "Is it the commander?" she asked. I drank my coffee. "That's not a no," Pip observed. "Finish your breakfast," I said. She finished her breakfast. I thought very carefully about what Pip had observed, and what it meant, and what I was going to do about it. What I did about it was this. I walked into Assessment Room 3 for the morning evaluation cycle, took my position in the second row of the standing assessment format, and when Commander Vesper Cade appeared in the gallery above to observe the cohort mid-assessment, which was a standard evaluation protocol, the presence of authority during sustained pressure to measure how it affected performance, I made a decision. I want to be clear, again, about what the decision was. It was not a plan I had constructed in advance. It was a decision made in the approximately 90 seconds between her appearance in the gallery and the moment she descended the staircase to the floor, descending, as she always did, with that measured pace, coming to stand at the back of the assessment row where she could observe the physical and cognitive performance of the candidates currently under load. She was 3 feet behind me. I could see her in my peripheral vision. I could smell the faint trace of cedar and something underneath it that was simply her, that I had catalogued without meaning to over 4 months of shared air in confined spaces. Her presence at the back of the room changed the temperature by 1 degree, and I had learned to account for that degree, so it did not affect my performance metrics. I had been accounting for it for 4 months. The tracking reassignment list had my name on it. I was being evaluated, managed, observed, and quietly redirected, and the only explanation that made sense, the one I had been refusing to look at directly because looking at it required me to account for every data point I had collected since June, was that Vesper Cade had been doing to my career what she had been doing to the rest of herself for 4 months. Managing the complication at arm's length, making professional decisions with personal variables behind them. And the only way to test that theory was to stop performing and start reacting. So I let my knees go. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a reach for the table. I let them go the way knees go when they have been locked in a standing position for too long and the blood has traveled away from where it is needed and the body decides, without consulting you, to renegotiate the arrangement. I let them go with just enough control to direct the direction of the fall, toward her. I felt the exact moment she caught me. Both arms, one at my back and one beneath my knees. The reflexive, immediate catch of someone who had not decided to catch me, but whose body had already made that decision before her mind could weigh in. The speed of it was the first data point. The strength of it was the second. The third, and the one that went through me like a current before I had time to prepare for it, was the way she pulled me in rather than holding me at arm's length, the way you pull something toward you that you are afraid of dropping. The gallery above erupted in the specific controlled chaos of a professional assessment environment when a candidate goes down. Tova Moss's voice cut through it cleanly. Assessment pause, medical protocol, cohort hold. Vesper was already moving. She did not call for a stretcher. She did not put me down and call for support. She carried me through the assessment room door, down the corridor with the institutional gray walls and the ventilation hum, through the secondary door that led to the medical anteroom. She moved without urgency and without any outward signal that she was having a reaction to the circumstances. I kept my eyes closed. I kept my breathing shallow and measured, the way it goes when consciousness is receding. I was aware, with a precision that was the opposite of unconscious, of every point of contact between her and my body. The warmth of her arm at my back, the specific texture of her jacket sleeve against my knees, the fact that she smelled at close range, like cedar and something clean, and underneath that, something I could not catalog because I had never been this close before. She put me down on the medical cot, settled me there with a care that was so specific and particular, and at total odds with the professional neutrality she maintained at all distances that I had to work to keep my face still. She checked my pulse at the wrist. Her fingers, settling against my pulse point, were warmer than I had expected and completely steady. I focused on keeping my breathing shallow. I focused on not thinking about the warmth. She stood there for a moment. Then she said quietly, into the medical anteroom, which was empty of anyone but the two of us, "Open your eyes, Solis." I opened my eyes. She was standing next to the cot, looking at me with that expression I had been cataloging for 4 months. The composed professional face with the thing underneath it that was not professional at all. Her arms were folded. The watch caught the light. There was nothing in her expression that could be described as surprise. "I want you to know," I said, "that the reassignment track review is not." "Don't," she said. Not loudly, not harshly. With the specific precision of someone who knew exactly what I had been about to do and had decided to prevent it. A silence. The anteroom's ventilation hummed. Somewhere in the distance, Assessment Room 3 was being dealt with. She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind the composed expression, something very controlled and very aware. She said, "Don't pretend again." I held her gaze. She said it again, quieter. "Don't pretend again." I said, "Was the carry necessary?" Her jaw set. 1 millimeter. "Medical protocol," she said. I said, "Medical protocol says we wait for the program medic." A pause. She looked at the wall, then back at me. She said nothing. I said, "Commander." She turned toward the door. "Don't pretend again," she said. To the wall, to the door, to whatever version of herself she was managing in this moment. Her voice was level and precise and small in a way it usually was not. She left. I lay on the medical cot in the humming anteroom for approximately 90 seconds. Then I sat up, located the water carafe on the side table, poured a glass, and tried to understand what had just happened. The data was clear. The carry had been immediate, unhesitating, and stronger than protocol required. The privacy of the anteroom had been deliberate. The warning, "Don't pretend again," was not a reprimand. A reprimand would have been delivered in the assessment room with witnesses. It would have gone into my file. It would have cited the specific policy against calculated behavior during evaluation protocols. "Don't pretend again" was something else. "Don't pretend again" was a woman who had caught someone falling toward her and understood, with a precision that cost her something, exactly what had been calculated in that fall. And who was telling her, in the only language she had available inside this building, that she was aware, that the awareness was the problem, and that she was not going to be able to account for what she might do if it happened again. I drank the water. The program medic arrived 7 minutes later, which was the actual protocol response time. She was brisk and thorough and found nothing medically remarkable, which was correct. She documented a potential orthostatic episode related to prolonged standing. She noted it in my program file. It was the kind of notation that read as a minor physical event and nothing else. I was cleared to return to the cohort that afternoon. Tova Moss met me at the anteroom door. She was 43 years old, had been with the program for 11 years, and had the specific patience of someone who had watched enough human behavior under institutional pressure to have stopped being surprised by any of it. She handed me a bottle of electrolyte solution without being asked. She said, "How's the head?" "Fine," I said. She nodded. She looked at me with those warm, precise eyes. She said, "The commander runs a tight program." I said, "Yes." She said, "She is very good at her job." I said, "I know." Tova said, "She is very good at her job, in particular with candidates whose performance could go either way, depending on how they are handled. Candidates who need the right kind of attention to reach their ceiling. She has identified about 4 such candidates in the current cohort." I looked at Tova. She looked back with the calm of a woman who had said the true thing and was not going to say it again. "Good to have you back," she said. "Assessment pickup is at 1400. She walked away. Pip was waiting in the corridor outside the cohort wing. She looked at me with those unfiltered 22-year-old eyes and said, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. She said, "The commander carried you." "I know," I said. Pip said, "She didn't wait for Medic Ralston. Everyone saw." I said, "Pip." She said, "Yes?" I said, "I need you to let this be a thing that happened and not a topic." She considered this with the earnest precision she brought to everything. "Okay," she said. "But for what it's worth, even Thoby said it looked different from how medical protocol usually looks." I said, "Thoby is astute." Pip said, "He also said he thought the commander knew you were awake." I said nothing. Pip said, "I told him he was probably right." I went to the dormitory and thought about "Don't pretend again" for the rest of the afternoon. The next 10 days proceeded along a pattern that I could see more clearly now than I had been able to before the assessment room. The pattern had always been there. I had been naming it as professional intensity, as the specific attention a program director brings to the candidates operating at the top of the performance range, as anything except what it actually was. What it actually was? Commander Vesper Cade managed the specific details of my program experience with a completeness that belonged to a different category than her management of the other candidates. She did not do it obtrusively. She did not do it in ways that would have been visible to anyone not paying close attention. But I was paying close attention. I had been paying close attention since June. She knew, without being told, that my left hip compensated during extended standing assessments. The scheduling of those assessments, which were technically managed by Tova's office, shifted across the second month in ways that distributed the load differently. I could not prove she had requested this. I could not prove she had not. She knew without being told that I ate badly when I was processing a difficult problem, that mental occupation crowded out physical awareness in ways that affected my performance metrics in the 48 hours following high-stakes evaluations. The team meals during those periods had options that I would have described as specifically calibrated for me, if I had been willing to describe them as anything at all. She corrected my performance in formal debrief with surgical precision and genuine investment, but the investment had a texture that was not entirely professional. When I got something right, when I made a call that required trusting my own read over the established framework, which was the thing she had said in the second month was the harder thing to teach, something happened in her eyes that was the inverse of the composed evaluation face, something that registered my success personally before the professional cataloged it. I kept the data. I sat with the data. I tried to make the data into something other than what it was. On the 11th day after Assessment Room 3, Dara Whitmore arrived. She came as a member of the Oversight Committee, a body that the program answered to, but that was rarely physically present. Oversight reviews were scheduled quarterly and were usually conducted by people who read files rather than watched assessments. Dara Whitmore read files and watched assessments. She was 40 years old, tall, with the particular ease of someone who had been in high-pressure institutional environments for so long that none of them alarmed her anymore. She had worked in federal policy for 15 years before moving to oversight work. She had the kind of face that made you tell her the true version of things without intending to. She introduced herself to the cohort at a general assembly on a Wednesday morning, with Vesper and Tova present, and her eyes moved through the room with the efficient interest of someone gathering information from the first moment. Her eyes landed on me for approximately 3 seconds longer than they landed on anyone else. I noted this because I was trained to note these things. I noted it, and I noted that Vesper, standing at the edge of the room in her standard position, had noted it too. The oversight review lasted 5 days. Dara attended 3 assessments, participated in 2 structured debrief observations, and conducted individual interviews with 6 candidates. A representative sample, she said in the opening briefing, selected to cross-reference the evaluator's performance data with direct candidate self-assessment. I was one of the 6. The interview was conducted in a small conference room in the East Wing. Dara Whitmore asked careful, layered questions. She was very good at her job, better than most of the evaluators in the program, in the specific sense that she knew how to make her questions feel like conversation rather than assessment. I answered her carefully. I had been trained for exactly this. Halfway through the interview, she said, with the casualness of someone who had made a deliberate choice to seem casual, "What is your working relationship with Commander Cade like?" I looked at her. She looked back with the easy attention of someone who was absolutely recording my pause. "She runs a precise program," I said. "She is the best evaluator I have worked with." Dara smiled. A small, clean, observant smile. She said, "That is a very professional answer." "She is a professional person," I said. Dara wrote something in her notes. She did not show me what she wrote. After the interview, I walked back toward the cohort wing and thought about the 3 extra seconds of eye contact and Dara Whitmore's small, observant smile and the thing she had written in her notes. On the 4th day of the oversight review, I was running the morning physical component with 3 other candidates in the compound's outdoor circuit when I heard footsteps on the track behind me. I did not look. I did not need to look. I had been in this compound for 4 months, and I knew the specific sound of Vesper Cade's stride as well as I knew the sound of the facility's ventilation system. She fell into pace beside me. We ran in silence for approximately 40 seconds. This was not unusual for her physical observation rounds. She sometimes ran alongside candidates during endurance components as a form of simultaneous observation and pressure application. She said, "Whitmore's interview notes flagged your performance trajectory for additional review." I said, "I know." She said, "The flag is positive. She is recommending field track confirmation." I said nothing for 5 seconds. Then I said, "The preliminary reassignment list had my name on it." Vesper was quiet for 3 strides. She said, "The list was preliminary." I said, "My name was on it before the positive flag." She said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" She said, "The flag changes the assessment." I said, "That is not an answer to the question I asked." She ran for a moment without speaking. Her stride was even, unhurried, the stride of someone who had been running for decades and had never needed to prove anything with it. She said, "Some assessment decisions require review before they are finalized." I said, "Some assessment decisions are based on variables that should not be part of the assessment." A silence, the track, the sound of her breathing, which was as controlled as everything else about her. She said, "Solus." I said, "Commander." She said, "Drop the pace." We slowed to a walk. The other candidates were ahead on the circuit. The early morning compound was mostly empty, the gray October light doing something precise to the trees at the perimeter fence. She said, "The reassignment review was not finalized," I said, "but it was initiated." She said nothing. I said, "Initiated based on what performance data?" My metrics are at program ceiling in 11 of 14 categories. My cognitive evaluation markers are the strongest in the current cohort. There is no legitimate performance-based argument for reassignment. She was looking at the fence line. I said, "So I need you to tell me what it was based on." She said, "I am reviewing it." I said, "You initiated it." A pause, long enough to mean something. She said, "I need to review my own decision before I can answer that." I stopped walking. She stopped one step later, which meant she was slightly ahead of me, not looking at me, her profile to the morning light. I had cataloged her profile. I had cataloged everything. I said, "I fainted into your arms on purpose." She went very still. I said, "You knew?" She said, "Yes." I said, "And you carried me anyway." A pause. She turned to look at me. The morning light was behind her, and her face was in partial shadow, and her expression was doing the thing it did when the composition was holding, but at higher cost than usual. She said, "Medical protocol." I said, "Vesper." She stopped. The word sat between us. I had never used her name before, not even in my own head. Always commander, always the title, the professional container. Something moved across her face. She said, very quietly, "Do not use my name like that while I am your assessor." I said, "Then tell me what the reassignment review was based on." A long silence. A bird in the fence-line trees. The hum of the compound security perimeter. She said, "It was based on a conflict I identified in my ability to evaluate you with the objectivity your assessment requires." The words landed. I said, "What kind of conflict?" She said, "The kind I am not going to describe while you are in this program." I said, "That is the closest thing to an honest answer you have given me in 4 months." She looked at me, the composed face working harder than usual. She said, "Go finish the circuit." I said, "You owe me the rest of that answer." She said, "I know." She walked away. I stood on the track and watched her go, and thought about the word conflict and what category of conflict it was, and what it meant that she had identified it and documented it, and then tried to reassign me rather than disclose it. I thought about the reassignment as the professional version of the same management she applied to everything. Finding the structural solution, the institutional container, the version where the personal variable could be removed from the equation rather than named. I thought about the carry, the immediate, undeliberate catch, the way she had pulled me in. I thought about her saying, "Do not use my name like that, while I am your assessor." While I am your assessor. Not, "Do not use my name." While I am your assessor. As if the category of what she was to me was the relevant restriction, and not the name itself. I finished the circuit. Dara Whitmore found me in the East Wing corridor the following morning. She was carrying a coffee, and had the relaxed attention of someone who was not technically performing a formal assessment at this moment. She said, "Walk with me." I walked with her. She said, "Your assessors think very highly of you," I said. "They are professional people." She said, "Some more professionally than others." I looked at her. She had the small observant smile again. She said, "I have been doing oversight reviews for 6 years. I know what a program looks like when it is running well, and I know what it looks like when there is a variable the evaluators are managing around rather than through." I said, "That is vague." She said, "It is as specific as I am allowed to be in my capacity." She stopped walking at the East Wing window. The compound grounds were visible from here, gray and precise in the October morning. She said, "The field track confirmation is legitimate. Your performance data supports it completely. Whatever else is happening in this program, your evaluation has been accurate where it counts." I said, "Whatever else is happening?" She said, "I did not say it was a problem." She looked at me directly. She said, "I said it was a variable. Variables can be managed well or badly. The question is which way this one is going. I said nothing. She said, "She is the best program director I have reviewed in 6 years. I want to be clear about that." I said, "She is." Dara said, "Yes, she is. She is also—" She paused, choosing precisely. "She is managing something that good program directors do not usually have to manage. I think she knows it." I said, "What are you recommending?" She looked at me. "The easy attention, the kind that made you tell the true version without intending to." She said, "I am not recommending anything about the personal variable. That is not my job. My job is program integrity. The program integrity, right now, is fine." She handed me a folded document. "Your field track confirmation," she said. "Signed off this morning, by me and by Commander Cade." She walked away. I stood at the east wing window and held the field track confirmation and thought about Vesper Cade signing a document that contradicted the preliminary reassignment she had initiated. I thought about what it meant to know you are doing the wrong thing and do the right thing anyway, without being asked, without anyone requiring you to. I held it at the edge of a name I was not ready to use yet. Dara Whitmore's oversight review ended that afternoon. She addressed the cohort at the final General Assembly and said the program was operating at the highest standard she had reviewed, and that she would be recommending renewal of its operational mandate to the board. She thanked Commander Cade with the specific precision of a professional who meant it. She looked at me once, briefly, as she was leaving. The small, observant smile. And then, she was gone. The compound settled back into its rhythm. Assessments resumed. The cohort moved through November with the particular grinding endurance of people who had survived 5 months of sustained pressure and could see the end of the cycle from where they were standing. 3 things changed. The first was that Vesper was in the building more. She had always described her schedule as intermittent, and it had always been more frequent than intermittent. But after Dara Whitmore's visit, it became simply present was the only word for it. She was in the assessment rooms. She was on the track in the mornings. She was in the facility at hours that the schedule did not require. Tova noticed. Tova said nothing about it, which was more information than saying something would have been. The second was that she stopped reaching for the professional framing when she made decisions that were specifically about me. She no longer justified the adjustments. When she modified an assessment parameter in my evaluation sequence, she said simply that she had modified it. When she corrected my performance in debrief, she said what was right without the surrounding architecture of institutional justification. The third, and the one that made the other 2 matter, was that she was not maintaining the eye contact protocol anymore. The eye contact protocol. In formal evaluation settings, direct eye contact with a candidate is held for 3 to 5 seconds and then directed elsewhere, to maintain the evaluative posture rather than the personal one. This was not a written protocol. It was simply how assessment worked, the specific language of evaluation as opposed to relationship. She had maintained it, with precision, since June. She was not maintaining it anymore. She looked at me in assessment rooms and did not look away first. She looked at me during morning briefings and held the contact past the 5-second mark into something that the rest of the room registered and then deliberately unregistered. I looked back. I was not going to be the one who looked away first. That had been established in October. The physical component of the 4th month was the most demanding. Extended field simulations, overnight scenarios, the kind of sustained pressure that stripped most candidates down to something more fundamental than their presenting version. I ran them clean. I made the right calls under sustained uncertainty. I came through every simulation with the performance markers that said field track and meant it. On the last night of the 4th simulation, we debriefed in the main assessment room at 2 a.m. with most of the cohort exhausted enough to be honest about it. Tova ran the debrief. Vesper was present. She was standing at the back of the room with her arms folded and her eyes moving through the cohort. When they reached me, They did not immediately move on. I was tired enough that I did not perform the management of noticing it. I looked back. She held it for 4 seconds. 5, 6. Pip, sitting beside me, made no sound but shifted in her chair in a way that said she had seen it and was processing the data. After the debrief, the cohort was released to the dormitory wing. I stopped in the corridor to drink from the water station. I heard footsteps and looked up, and Vesper was there, not in the direction of the exit but in the direction of the assessment review offices. She was carrying the debrief files, and she was moving past me. Or she would have been moving past me, except she slowed. She stopped. She was 2 feet from me. The corridor was empty except for us. It was 2:14 in the morning, and we had been in assessments for 18 hours, and she was standing 2 feet away from me with debrief files in her arms, and her hair had come loose at the back of her neck, one strand falling against her collar, which I had never seen happen before. I said, "You looked at me for 6 seconds during the debrief." She said, "I know." I said, "That is not assessment protocol eye contact duration." She said, "I know," I said. "You told me not to use your name while you are my assessor. That implies there is a version of this where the assessor category ends." She said nothing. I said, "The cycle ends in 4 weeks." She said, "Yes." I said, "What happens in 4 weeks?" She looked at me, both hands on the debrief files, the controlled stillness she used when she was deciding something. The strand of hair at her collar, the corridor light doing something specific to the lines of her face. She said, "Right now I am still your assessor." I said, "I know. I am asking about after." She said, "After is after." I said, "That is an answer." She said, "It is not a full one." I said, "I know, but it is more than you have given me." She looked at me for 1 full second, unguarded in the way that people go unguarded when they are exhausted, and the management has been running so long it gets loose at the edges. Then she squared her shoulders and the management came back. She said, "Get some sleep. Morning assessment is at 7. She walked away. I stood in the corridor at 2:14 in the morning and thought about after is after, and the strand of hair at her collar and the way she had said it is not a full one, and what it meant that she had looked at me for 6 seconds in a room full of witnesses. I thought about 4 weeks. I thought, 4 weeks is not very long at all. The following week, during a high-pressure conflict simulation involving a false institutional authority challenge, she pulled me from the evaluation record. Not from the simulation. From the evaluation record. The simulation required candidates to resist a false authority directive, to identify, under pressure, that the person presenting as institutional authority was not actually authorized to give the directive. I identified it correctly inside the first 90 seconds. I logged the correct call, documented my reasoning, and continued the simulation. Vesper, observing from the gallery, noted something in her evaluation file. After the simulation, I received my assessment summary. Under the relevant evaluation category, instead of my performance notation, there was a flag indicating conflict of interest recusal. That the lead evaluator had recused herself from assessing this component, and the assessment had been reassigned to Associate Evaluator Brennan. I looked at the flag. I looked at it for a long time. Then I went to Vesper's office. She was at her desk. She looked up when I came in. She did not look surprised. I sat down in the chair across from her without being invited. I said, "You recused from my conflict simulation assessment." She said, "Yes." I said, "On what grounds?" She said, "I have a standing conflict of interest disclosure pending." She had filed a conflict of interest disclosure on herself, in her own program. I said, "When did you file it?" She said, "This week." I said, "What does it cover?" She looked at me steadily, the composed professional face which was not entirely composed. She said, "It covers the appropriate categories." I said, "Does it cover the reassignment review?" She said. Yes. I said. Does it cover the assessment room? A pause. She said. The incident is documented in the medical file. I said. That is not what I asked. She looked at the desk. I said. Does the disclosure cover why you carried me instead of waiting for Medic Ralston? She said nothing for a long moment. Then she looked up. She said. Yes, it covers that. I said. And you filed it voluntarily. She said. Yes. I said. Why this week? She said. Because after is 4 weeks away, and I will not spend 4 weeks doing this the wrong way. The room went very still. I looked at her. This woman who had run the most precise selection process I had ever been through, who had caught me before her mind could tell her not to, who had filed a conflict of interest disclosure on herself before she was required to, because the alternative was a version of things she had decided was wrong. I said, What does the disclosure mean for the rest of the cycle? She said, My assessments are co-signed by Tova for the next 4 weeks. Full transparency on all evaluation decisions. I said, And after that? She said, I am no longer your assessor. I said, And then what? She said, Very precisely. And then I say the things I have been not saying for 4 months, and you decide what to do with them. I looked at her. She held my gaze without flinching. This was the composure used as a foundation, not a wall. This was the version that came after the decision had already been made. I said, 4 weeks. She said, 4 weeks. I said, I am going to need you to not look at me for 6 seconds in debriefs during those 4 weeks. Something happened in her face, the corner of her mouth, barely, 1 millimeter. She said, I will do my best. I said, Your best is very good. She said, Not always. I said, I know. I have been documenting the exceptions. She looked at me with those clear gray eyes that cataloged everything, and for the first time in 4 months disclosed something back. Something small. Something that cost her enough that she looked away after. She said, Go. Please. I went. I walked back through the compound in the gray November afternoon and thought about 4 weeks and a conflict of interest disclosure and the way she had said, I will do my best with that precise, almost private version of her voice. I thought about it until I was at the dormitory wing and Pip was in the corridor with her clear 22-year-old eyes. She said, You went to the commander's office. I said, Yes. She said, You were in there for 9 minutes. I said, Pip. She said, Sorry, is everything okay? I thought about that. I said, Yes. She said, Okay. She went back to her room. I stood in the dormitory corridor with 4 weeks between me and the thing that had been building since June, and thought about how completely insufficient 4 weeks suddenly seemed as a unit of time. I thought about her filing the disclosure, about choosing the harder version, the transparent one, the one that went into a record and could not be undone, before anyone required her to. About sitting in a position of authority over a situation she had identified as compromised and doing the correct thing with that knowledge, even when doing the correct thing cost her. I thought, she has been this person for 4 months, and I have been watching her be this person for 4 months, and the thing I felt in the assessment room when her arms caught me was not surprise. I had known. Since somewhere in July, I had known. The dormitory was quiet. Outside the compound's narrow windows, the November afternoon was getting dark. I thought, 4 weeks. And then, underneath that, I have been waiting since June. 4 weeks is nothing. The 4 weeks were the most precise weeks of my professional life, and the most difficult 4 weeks of my personal one, and the line between those two categories had never been simultaneously so clear or so costly. Under the conflict of interest disclosure, Vesper's evaluations of me were co-signed by Tova. Every assessment decision documented, every justification on record. This was the accountability structure, and it was correct. And it produced, as accountability structures often do when the person subject to them is genuinely committed to them, a transparency that was more revealing rather than less, because the professional frame had always been the container for the other thing. When the container became glass, when every assessment decision required a second signature and a paper trail, what sat inside it became visible in a way that 6 months of careful management had been specifically designed to prevent. Tova noticed. She said nothing directly, which was precisely how Tova communicated things she had decided were yours to deal with. Pip noticed. She said everything directly, which was precisely how Pip communicated things she had decided were too important to leave unaddressed. She said, on the second week of the final cycle, "The commander watched you run the surveillance rotation for 11 minutes from the gallery this morning and did not write anything on her clipboard." I said, "She was observing." Pip said, "She was watching." There is a difference, and you know it. I said, "Pip." She said, "I am just saying, there are 6 other candidates she could have been observing. She picked the gallery above your rotation." I said, "She picked the most complex rotation." Pip said, with the calm of someone who had decided to say a true thing and was going to say it all the way through. "The most complex rotation is Thoby's. He is running 3 simultaneous surveillance threads and a counter-surveillance component. You are running 1 clean thread with excellent execution. She was not there for the complexity." I looked at Pip. She said, "I am going to pass this program with high marks and get placed in an analytical role where my specific talents are actually appreciated. And I am going to look back at this period of my life and say the most interesting thing that happened was watching 2 extremely competent professionals be completely unwilling to say something that was already obvious to every other person in the compound." She went back to her evaluation prep. I thought about what she had said for the rest of the afternoon, which was the effect Pip reliably had on me regardless of whether I wanted it. The capstone assessment was on the last Friday of the 4th month. The most high-stakes evaluation in the program, a full-day integrated scenario combining field operations, cognitive pressure, interpersonal conflict management, and institutional authority challenge, all running simultaneously and intersecting in ways you could not fully anticipate. Your entire program placement rode on it. I had prepared for it for 6 months. Vesper recused herself from the assessment room, not from the compound, from the room. She filed a recusal notice with Tova at 7 that morning. Conflict of interest, full recusal, assessment to be conducted and evaluated entirely by the associate evaluators. And she was not in the assessment room at any point during the 12 hours that followed. I knew she had recused. Tova told me quietly before the assessment began, not to inform me of the stakes, but to ensure I understood the evaluation parameters. I ran the assessment clean. I made every right call. I hit the authority challenge correctly, managed the conflict component with the precision that the program had been developing in me for 6 months, and at the end of 12 hours when the evaluators told me I could stand down, I walked out of the assessment room into the corridor and found Vesper. She was in the corridor, not near the assessment room entrance, further down near the east wing window, with her jacket folded over her arm and her hands at her sides. She was there for no documented reason. I walked toward her. She did not move. I said, "You recused from the capstone." She said yes. I said, "You have been at this program for 4 years. You have never recused from a capstone." She said no. I said, "Was the recusal about the assessment?" She said, "The assessment required my neutrality. I could not guarantee my neutrality. So I recused." I said, "Could not guarantee it in what specific way?" She looked at me. In the corridor, in the late afternoon light that came through the east wing window, she looked the way she had looked on the track in October, and in her office the day she filed the disclosure. Like someone who had stopped arguing with what was true and was learning to stand inside it instead. she said, in the way where, if you had done something wrong, I would have been tempted to not document it correctly. The corridor was very quiet. I said, I did not do anything wrong. She said, I know. You were right about everything. I said, I need you to say the rest. She looked at the window. She said, the reassignment review was initiated because I watched you in a debrief in September and understood that I was no longer able to evaluate you the way you deserved to be evaluated. Because I had been watching you since June with a completeness that had nothing to do with your assessment score. Because the carry was not protocol. Because the anteroom was not protocol. Because I filed the disclosure this month instead of in September because I told myself the problem could be managed inside the professional frame. And I was wrong, and it cost you 3 months of having your assessment affected by variables you did not agree to. She said all of this to the East Wing window. Then she turned. She said, that is the rest. I said, not all of it. Her jaw set. That 1 millimeter. I said, the part you said was not for while you are my assessor. The program ends tomorrow. Say that part. A long silence. The ventilation hummed. Somewhere in the compound, the rest of the cohort was already beginning to celebrate the end of the capstone. I could hear the distant edge of it. She said, very quietly, I have been paying attention to you in a way that has been... She stopped. Started again, more quietly still. In a way that I have not been able to qualify as professional for a very long time. I said, how long? She said, since July. I said, July? She said, the 3rd week. You made a call in the counter-surveillance drill that every evaluator in the gallery thought was wrong. It was not wrong. I knew it was not wrong in the first 15 seconds, and I watched you hold the call for 3 minutes against 5 other evaluators questioning it. And you were right. And you knew you were right. And the specific quality of your certainty when you were right was... She stopped again. It was not something I was prepared for. I looked at her. She said, I am aware that this is an inadequate accounting. I am aware that I have made decisions in the past 4 months that cost you things. I am not asking you to weigh those against this. I am telling you the full version because you asked for it and you are owed it. I said, you filed the disclosure. She said, yes. I said, you recused from the capstone. She said, yes. I said, you are stepping back from program directorship next cycle. She looked at me. She had not announced that publicly yet. I said, Tova is not subtle when she is impressed by something. A pause. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. She said, I told the oversight committee this morning. 1 cycle. A voluntary step back to allow the disclosure period to resolve cleanly. I said, that was not required of you. She said, no. I said, you did it anyway. She said, I did not want to spend next cycle in this building thinking about whether what I was doing was right. I already did that for 4 months. It is not a sustainable working condition. I said, what is sustainable? She looked at me. Steady. The composure that was a foundation now, not a wall. She said, you. Somewhere that is not this program. After the placement period has started and the professional structure has resolved. You, in the honest version, without the assessment frame between us. I said, that is the most direct thing you have said to me since July. She said, I know. I am aware that the timing of the directness is not ideal. I said, it is better than never. She said, yes, it is. The corridor hummed around us. Outside, the November dusk was settling over the compound perimeter. I said, the placement period is 12 weeks. She said, yes. I said, and after 12 weeks. She said, after 12 weeks, I would like to find you in a place that is not this compound and say the rest of it without a disclosure form between us. I said, say what rest of it? She said, quietly, the way she said all the things that cost her. that I am not easy, that I am precise in ways that can read as cold, that I have difficulty with the parts of myself I cannot make functional, that I managed the distance between us as a problem for 4 months before I managed it as a responsibility, and that sequence was wrong and cost you something. I am aware of all of these things, and that none of them change what I want to say in 12 weeks. I said, then say it now. The last piece. Just that part. She looked at me for a long moment. The corridor, the window, the distant celebration that was not where we were. She said, that I am in love with you. I have been since somewhere around October, and the specific quality of the way you looked at me from a medical cot when I told you to open your eyes, and I did not say it inside the compound, because I did not have the right to say it inside the compound, and I am saying it now because I have nothing except the right to say it now. I said, October. She said, yes. I said, I caught you watching me in July. She said, I know you did. I said, I let you keep watching. She said, I know that too. Tova appeared at the far end of the corridor. She looked at us. She looked at the specific quality of the space between us. She said, from a professional distance that was doing a great deal of work, cohort celebration is in the main assembly room. Remy, you should be there. She walked away without waiting for an answer, which was itself an answer. I looked at Vesper. She looked back. I said, I will see you in 12 weeks. She said, yes. I left. I walked toward the celebration at the far end of the compound and thought about October and July and 12 weeks and the word right, used that way, and what it meant that she had said it in a corridor with nothing institutional between us at all. The cohort dispersed over the following week. Placement notifications went out. Field track, analytical track, liaison track. The careful sorting of 42 people into the specific versions of the work they had been selected for. I received field track, first priority placement. The placement city was a 7-hour drive from the compound. Vesper's voluntary step back from program directorship was announced internally on the last official day of the cycle. The language was precise and disclosed nothing except the decision and its duration. The cohort received it with the professional equanimity of people who had been trained for 6 months to accept information without editorializing publicly. Pip said to me, in the dormitory wing while we were packing, she is taking herself off the program. I said, for 1 cycle. Pip said, because of the disclosure. I said, yes. Pip said, that is a very significant thing to do voluntarily. I said, yes, it is. Pip looked at me for a moment with those clear, unfiltered 22-year-old eyes, and then she said, I hope it works out. It was the most direct and least analytical thing she had ever said to me. I understood that she meant it precisely. I said, thank you, Pip. She went back to her packing. I drove out of the compound on a Monday in December with the placement documents in my bag and the field track assignment, and the specific knowledge that 12 weeks stood between me and the honest version. 12 weeks felt very long. They pass the way demanding work passes when you are new to it, and it is genuinely hard and requires everything you have, completely and then suddenly. The field placement was precisely what the program had been building me for. I was good at it in the specific way that the program had identified and developed. I worked long hours. I made correct calls. I learned the particular texture of operational work in the way you can only learn it from inside. I did not contact Vesper, not because I did not want to, because she had said 12 weeks, and she had meant 12 weeks, and the version of her that had filed the disclosure and recused from the capstone and stepped back from directorship deserved the full 12 weeks without me making it shorter because I was impatient. I was very impatient. At the field placement, I worked alongside 3 other program graduates and a senior field officer who had been doing operational work for 20 years and moved through it with the unhurried competence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. She asked me in the 4th week where I had trained. I told her. She said, "Good program, precise director." I said, "Yes." She said, "She sends the right people." I said, "She does." I did not elaborate, neither did she. Some things in this kind of work you understand without being told, and the specific category of what Vespercade sent into the field was one of them. I was also, for the first time in several years, doing work that felt precisely matched to who I was. I noted this. I noted it as one of the things Vespercade had done for me that she had not been required to do, had identified the category of person I was and built a program that developed it, and had done that work cleanly and correctly, even while managing everything else. The field track she had signed off on was right. She had known it was right. She had signed it anyway. I thought about that, on the hard days of the placement, and it helped. On the 84th day after leaving the compound, my phone received a message at 7 in the morning. It said, "I am in the city through Thursday for an oversight consultation. Are you available for coffee? Not a professional call." Not a professional call. The specific care of that last sentence, the refusal to let it be ambiguous. I wrote back, "Tomorrow morning. There is a place on Callister Street that does not follow sports." She wrote back, "I will find it." She was there when I arrived. Dark jeans, a charcoal coat, no lanyard, no clipboard, no professional architecture of any kind around her. Her hair was down. I had seen it down exactly twice before today. The corridor at 2 in the morning in November, and here in a coffee shop in February, which meant it was significant both times, and she knew it. She had already ordered. My coffee was on the table, made correctly. She was looking at the door when I came in. I sat down. I said, 12 weeks. She said, 84 days. I said, "You counted." She said, "Yes." I looked at her. This woman, in a coffee shop, without any of the containers that had defined every interaction between us for 7 months. She looked like herself in a way that the compound had only allowed in fragments, in a corridor at night, in an office with the door closed, on a track in the gray October morning. Here she was fully, without anything between us, and the room was warm and ordinary, and it was still the most significant space I had been in since the assessment room. She said, "I have been thinking about what I want to say and the order to say it in for approximately 84 days. I said, "Then say it." She said, "I am not easy. I am precise in ways that can read as cold. I have difficulty with the parts of myself that I cannot make functional. I managed the thing between us as a problem for 4 months before I managed it as a responsibility, and that sequence was wrong, and cost you something real. I am aware of all of these things. I am telling you now because you deserve the full version without editing." I said, "Keep going." She said, "I have been thinking about you since July, since the counter-surveillance drill and the specific quality of your certainty when you were right and everyone else was wrong. I have been thinking about you in ways that have not been professionally appropriate, and that I converted into professional decisions because it was the only container available to me, and I was afraid of what the honest container looked like. And I am—" She stopped. One beat. The kind of pause that happens when a very controlled person decides to say the true thing all the way. "I am in love with you. I have been in love with you since October, and I did not say it inside the compound, because I did not have the right to say it inside the compound, and I am saying it now because I have nothing except the right to say it now, and I wanted you to hear it without anything between us." The coffee shop was warm and ordinary around us. Someone at another table was having a quiet argument with their laptop. The door opened and let in the February cold for a second and then closed. I said, "I need to ask you something." She said, "Ask." I said, "If the cycle had ended differently, If my performance had been genuinely insufficient, what would you have done? She looked at me steadily. She said, I would have given you the accurate assessment. I would not have recommended you for field track. I would have told you why, specifically and honestly, without softening it. And I would have done all of that, and it would have cost me more than the disclosure and the recusal and the step back combined. I said, because? She said, because watching you not reach where you were capable of reaching would have been worse than not having you in the building. I said, that is the most honest thing you have ever said to me. She said, it is the most honest thing I have said to anyone in several years. I reached across the table, not as a claim. I touched her hand where it rested on the table. 2 fingers, briefly. The way you touch something you want to confirm is real. She went very still. I said, I have been watching you be the most precise and the most careful and the most honest person I have encountered in a professional context for 7 months. She said, that is a qualified description. I said, let me finish. She said, sorry. I said, and I have been trying for most of those 7 months to convince myself that the watching was professional. It was not professional. It was personal before the 2nd month ended. You caught me in an assessment room and I felt it in the place where things land when they are not going to leave, and I have been thinking about that since October. She looked at my hand on hers. She said, Remy. The name, in her voice, was exactly what it had always been going to be. Precise and personal, and landing in the place where things do not leave. I said, yes. She turned her hand over beneath mine. I said, I am going to need you to be patient with me. I am in a field placement that is new and demanding and that I am very good at and intend to be better at. She said, I know, I said, and I do not know yet what the shape of this looks like in the practical version. She said, neither do I said, but I want to find out. She said, so do I said, then we find out. She said, yes. Her hand, turned over, was warm. The coffee shop noise moved around us and the February light came through the front window, and I thought about the assessment room and the carry and the specific precision with which she had said, don't pretend again. Not as a reprimand, but as a reckoning. A woman already accounting for what she had done before she had fully understood what she was doing. I said, for what it is worth. I am glad I fainted. She said, for what it is worth. I am glad I caught you. I said, you caught me very fast. She said, I know. It concerned me at the time. I said, and now? She said, now it does not. I said, because? She looked at me with those gray eyes that cataloged everything and disclosed, now, something. She said, because I am not managing it anymore. We stayed for 2 hours. We talked about the field placement and the step-back cycle, and what February in this city looked like from outside the compound walls, and the specific satisfaction of doing work that was correctly matched to who you were. We talked about what careful looked like in the practical version, and agreed that careful was not the same as slow, and that both of us understood the distinction. When we left, she held the door. On the pavement outside, she stood in the February cold in her charcoal coat and looked at me with the direct attention that had been tracking me since June. No longer the assessment face, not the management face, just her own face, aimed at mine with nothing between them. I took 1 step toward her. She stayed where she was and let me. I touched her jaw first. Warm skin. A sharp, quiet breath. Then I kissed her. It was not frantic. It was not desperate. It was patient and specific, and landed exactly where all of it had been building since October, since July, since the corridor and the assessment room and the carry and 84 days of not contacting her because she deserved the full 12 weeks. All that restraint finally becoming something honest. She kissed me back with the same precision she brought to everything. Complete attention, nothing wasted, no distance left to maintain. When we stepped back, the February pavement was cold and ordinary, and the city was going about its morning entirely unaware. She was looking at me with those eyes and the composure that was real, and the feeling underneath it that she had finally stopped treating as a problem. We stood there for another moment, not filling it, not managing it, just standing in something that had finally arrived after a long transit, letting it settle into the shape it had always been going to take. I said, "I will see you again." She said, "Yes." I said, "When?" She said, "When you want." I looked at her. The specific quality of when you want. No conditions, no protocol, no structure between the wanting and the answer. I said, "Next week." She said, "Yes." I walked away. On the corner, I stopped and looked back. She was still standing on the pavement outside the coffee shop, watching me go, her hands in the pockets of the charcoal coat and her hair down in the February light. She looked like a woman who had done hard and costly and correct things and was standing on the other side of them. She looked like someone I was going to know for a very long time. 3 months later, she attended a joint oversight briefing at the field placement office. She came in her professional capacity. She sat at the far end of the table from me and conducted herself with complete and impeccable neutrality throughout the briefing. When it was over and the room was clearing, she stopped in the doorway. She said, at a normal volume, in front of the 3 remaining colleagues who were gathering their materials, "Your threat analysis in the 3rd scenario was right." I said, "I know." She said, I wanted to say it out loud. My colleague at my left, who had been in this office for 6 years and had developed the specific professional radar that 6 years in this kind of work produces, said nothing. She gathered her materials with the calm of someone who had noticed something and was choosing to keep her own counsel about it. Vesper left. My colleague said, "Is she the one from the program?" I said, "Yes." She said, "She looked at you the way someone looks at a door they have already decided to open." I said, "I know." She said, "Okay." She went back to her desk. I thought about the February morning and the charcoal coat and the patient, earned kiss on a cold pavement. And I thought about October and July and the counter-surveillance drill and Don't Pretend Again and 84 days and When You Want, and I thought, she is the most precise person I have ever met in my life. I thought, she caught me faster than anything she was trained to catch. I thought, I have been waiting since July. I have all the time there is. I was right about all of it.